I'm Suzanne for Green Left. Thank you for joining us. The recent attacks on Iran by Israel and the United States, on top of Israel's ongoing genocide in Gaza, has destabilised the region even more than usual and exposed the rest of the world to increased nuclear risk. While Australia insists that it's all part of Israel's right to defend itself, and we continue to help Israel arm itself through defence contracts and provide an unknown amount of intel to the conflicts in the region via the Pine Gap facility, Australia's involvement is getting murkier by the day. To talk to us some more about that, we're joined today by New South Wales Green Senator David Shoebridge, in his capacity as Green spokesperson for, for Defence, Home Affairs, for Peace and Nuclear Disarmament and Foreign Affairs. He joins us now. David Shoebridge, welcome.
Yeah, good to be speaking, Susan. It would be nicer in other circumstances, but still, it's very important we have the chat.
Now, the Greens have said all along that the attacks against Iran are outright illegal and that, unlike Israel, Iran have allowed inspectors in to confirm they don't have nuclear weapons. The subsequent US attacks apparently involved three of something in Iran called nuclear enrichment facilities. Now, if they're not nuclear facilities, what are they for, and what is the International Atomic Energy Agency saying about them now?
Well, the International Atomic Energy Agency has, on at least two public occasions since this conflict escalated, made it very clear that they had no evidence that Iran was proceeding to build a nuclear bomb. And indeed, that was confirmed by US security agencies' evidence given to Congress and provided publicly that that the US had no evidence that Iran was proceeding to make a nuclear bomb. And indeed, their best understanding of events was that there had been a decision by the Iranian regime not to make a bomb. Of course, the IAEA had also delivered a report about a week or so before the escalation and the Israeli attack started, saying that there had been non-compliance by Iran with their reporting obligations to the IAEA. And they set out that certain information had not been provided, and they gave quite a caustic report. But of course, in that, they also said that they were calling for negotiation and discussion. They pointed out how incredibly dangerous it would be if that led to an attack on nuclear facilities, and strongly urged there to be a peaceful dialogue. So the IAEA has said there's non-compliance by Iran. They've said that there's no evidence that they were producing a nuclear bomb. That's backed up by United States Security Agency information. Of course, no doubt under pressure from the Trump administration, the US security agencies have been desperately backpedaling since they attacked Iran. But all the evidence we had, credible international evidence we had, was that Iran was not making a nuclear bomb and was not the imminent threat that Benjamin Netanyahu, Penny Wong and Donald Trump have said.
So what is a nuclear enrichment facility, please, David? Just enlighten us on what exactly that would be used for.
Well, they can be used for a variety of civilian purposes. I think people are quite right to be anxious about nuclear enrichment facilities that take nuclear energy, nuclear enrichment beyond what would normally be required for civilian uses. And Iran was, it appeared, enriching high-grade nuclear material beyond what would normally be required for a civilian use. Of course, there may be experimental reasons for that, but one of the other reasons why Iran could have been getting that was to take some preliminary steps if they chose to make a nuclear weapon that would enable them to make a nuclear weapon. I don't think anyone looks at this and says, well, Iran is a totally neutral player in this, and everything they were doing was for credible civilian purposes. But it's quite one other thing to say that the evidence was that these enrichment facilities were in the process of making an Iranian nuclear bomb. Indeed, again, I repeat, it's contrary to the evidence of the International Atomic Energy Agency.
So, all that being the case, what is Israel and the US real justification for going in? Because it seems rather preemptive at best.
Well, Israel's alleged justification was Iran was about to have a nuclear weapon outside of any kind of international regime that would permit them to have a nuclear weapon. The United States has nuclear weapons. The They have non-proliferation obligations under the NPT treaty, allegedly to be getting rid of their nuclear weapons. I haven't seen much evidence of them doing that, but they at least have some kind of legal facade that covers the holding of their nuclear weapons. Of course, Israel, as we know, has a very significant nuclear arsenal. They haven't declared how many nuclear weapons they have, but credible reports say up to 200 nuclear weapons. Israel is not a party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Israel, unlike Iran, does not permit the International Atomic Energy Agency to inspect its nuclear facilities and keeps it incredibly secret. So Israel, with heaven knows how many nuclear weapons in a secret program which has no inspections by the IAEA, is the basis it's using for attacking Iran is that Iran, which does let International Atomic Energy Agency's inspectors in, which had detailed reports about it, and where the evidence was they didn't have a nuclear weapon, used the potential of an Iranian nuclear weapon, the imminent potential, they said, as the reason why they attacked them. No international lawyer worth their salt in any way says that Israel's justification was legal. It was an unlawful, illegal attack on Iran under international law. And I don't think there's really any credible questioning of that.
Now, because of all that, there's been considerable mass protests against what Israel's doing on a number of fronts. Australia's been called on domestically many times to cut their two-way military trade, and we're also providing who knows what intel to conflict in the region via Pine Gap. What do we know about what's being what role Pine Gap plays in providing intelligence to the US and Israel in this ever-burgeoning conflict, and what are the Greens wanting them to change in relation to that?
Well, the government has refused to tell the Australian public what the role of Pine Gap was in this most recent attack. I mean, the Pine Gap is meant to be a joint Australia-US intelligence spy facility in the middle of Australia. It's the closest township near it is Alice Springs in the centre of the country. Now, the reason why the government is not telling the Australian public about the role of Pine Gap in these attacks, well, there's two potential reasons. One is the US hasn't told them and won't tell them, which of course is incredibly disturbing for a notionally joint Australian facility in the middle of our own country. The second and probably more likely explanation is they know exactly the role that Pine Gap has, and they just don't want the public to know the role that Pine Gap had. We do know that Pine Gap was used recently in drone attacks on Yemen by the United States for targeting those drone attacks on Yemen. We know that it has a role in sifting, obtaining, assessing and disseminating targeting information, which has been used by both the Israeli armed forces and the United States armed forces in the Middle East. We know that because a whistleblower came out recently and spoke to a journalist and told them about the way that Pine Gap had been used for targeting by both Israel and the US in the Middle East. And we also know that whilst the high profile part of this attack was through B-2 bombers and very large, incredibly large conventional bombs that were dropped by the US. And I can't tell you, there's no example of those being used in warfare before, so I can't tell you the history of Pine Gap being used to target those devices. But we do know another part of the attack was from Tomahawk missiles being fired by US maritime assets in the region. And that is the nature of an attack that is regularly targeted using Pine Gap, US attacks using Pine Gap. So it's highly likely that Pine Gap was used in this attack. We know from the advice of eminent international lawyers like Ben Saul, the Chalice Chair of international law at Sydney University, probably one of the globe's preeminent international lawyers. We know that what the United States did in its attacks on Iran was in gross breach of international law. And so to think that Pine Gap has been used to facilitate a unilateral attack on a third country in breach of international law, I find deeply, deeply troubling.
So what is all this doing, with your Home Affairs hat on, to our local domestic risk rating, our involvement in all of these conflicts and Pine Gap and weapons contracts and all the rest of it? Where does that leave us in terms of our domestic risk rating?
Well, I mean, engaging in immoral, unethical, illegal wars against any country obviously is creates the potential for significant tensions in Australia. It's not only morally wrong for our country to cheer in this illegal attack by the United States. It's not only a breach of international law, but when citizens in this country see our government acting so grossly unethically and see them uncritically cheering in Donald Trump when he engages in yet another US attack on a country in the Middle East. I mean, the Albanese government regularly talks about social harmony and not bringing conflicts here. Well, when they uncritically cheer in and yet another illegal attack by the United States on a Middle Eastern majority Muslim country like this, and they do it, deliberately, consciously, of course it causes tensions in Australia. I mean, my hope that those tensions play out in peaceful debate, in peaceful protest, and to date that's how I've seen it play out, in peaceful protest. But it's obviously inflammatory from our government to do that.
Now, speaking of US alliances and maritime assets, I'd like to ask you quickly about AUKUS. Now, I understand Albanese was intending to raise this at the recent G7 in Canada and is still talking up AUKUS all over town. Is there any real likelihood, David, we're ever going to get out of this submarine deal, or is Australia so deep politically that they have to go ahead with it regardless of its real value?
Well, I mean, there's probably a number of scenarios for AUKUS. The least likely scenario is it remains on track for five decades and we get 6 nuclear submarines out of it. That's, I think we can say, is the least likely scenario, that we have an ongoing, stable and positive relationship with the United States for the next 5 decades and we get 6 nuclear submarines. I think we can put that in kind of, young adult fiction section of the of the library. The more likely outcome in the short term is of course, Donald Trump is currently has initiated a review of AUKUS to report back in, potentially only a matter of weeks. When the United States is doing a review like that, I mean, it's in the form of an effective shakedown by the Trump administration. The United States probably wants to keep AUKUS on track for at least the next 2 or so years, because as we're speaking, the Australian taxpayers are building the United States a nuclear submarine attack base at the cost of $1.7 billion on Garden Island, just off Fremantle and Perth in WA. And that's been built by Australians to provide a forward base for American nuclear submarines, the Virginia-class submarines, so that they can more readily go up to the Malacca Straits and then engage in the United States containment program against China. The US wants that nuclear submarine base, and they're particularly grateful that Australia's building it for them for nothing off Perth and is willing to then maintain it for nothing off Perth for them. And so I think the US wants to keep that on track. They may want to just also force Australia to open up an eastern coast base as well, probably at Port Kembla in my beautiful home state of New South Wales. So in the short term, the United States would like to keep AUKUS on track, I think, to deliver that for them. And also to, further embed all the other US assets in Australia, like their 2,500 Marines in Darwin, their nuclear capable B-52s in Tyndall, keep Pine Gap, as their nice, secure, pretend joint asset, and also the Northwest Cape, which is in Northwest Australia, and which the US uses to communicate with its nuclear submarine fleet. So if a US president sends a button to destroy the world as we know it with intercontinental ballistic missiles from their nuclear submarine fleet, that'll come out of Northwest Cape, out of Australia. So they want to keep all that. They want to keep all that on track. So what's the most likely outcome? Well, the most likely outcome from this review is that Donald Trump says, well, Australia's not spending enough on defence. It's meant to be a partnership. It's not a partnership. You're spending, what, 2.1%, 2.2% on defence. We want you to spend 5% on defence. If you want to stay in AUKUS, ramp up your defence spending, buy a lot of US weapons, buy billions and billions of dollars more of US weapons. And they're also likely to not miss the chance for a shakedown and say, and by the way, you also have to put more money into AUKUS and give us yet more money for our nuclear submarine program, which is woefully behind schedule and is unlikely to produce nuclear submarines for Australia in the short term. Australia's already agreed to give about $4.7 billion to the US nuclear submarine industrial base. It's highly likely, I think, that Donald Trump will use this review to shake down Anthony Albanese and Richard Marles and see if they've got any more money in their pockets and get some more in the short term. Where does that leave Australia? Well, that leaves Australia dangerously exposed to a bullying regime who will be, seeking to direct our defence and fiscal policy via Washington.
On top of which, The Guardian's reported that also at the G7, Albanese was seeking to negotiate a new defence agreement with the European Union, which, as we all know, generally means more defence contracts. So what's the most likely outcome of that?
I just wish that Anthony Albanese travelled the world with his Google Maps open. I don't know about you, but last time I checked, we're not in Europe. And the idea that we're having, a defence agreement with Europe or desperately trying to join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization or whatever the hell their plans are, I mean, it's got the look of desperation to it at the moment, that they're realizing that the US relationship is really on the nose with the Australian public, who are deeply worried about an erratic, dangerous Trump presidency and what they see as an increasingly erratic, dangerous US politics that is very much strained from our values and our sense of international law. They know that that's on the nose. They've got, what, a $375 billion bet with the US on AUKUS, and that doesn't look particularly good at the moment. And so rather than think, well, actually, why don't we, open up Google Maps and see where we are? We happen to live in Oceania, to the bottom of Asia, and that's our neighbourhood. Our region involves countries like Indonesia and Malaysia, Singapore, Japan, China, South Korea. It doesn't involve Austria, Hungary, Poland, Germany, and France. That's not our region. That's not where we need to be building our relations and our connections, particularly of a defence nature and a mutual defence nature. So it shows a sort of desperate misallocation of resources. What I would love Anthony Albanese and Richard Marles to be doing is, instead of trotting off to the Netherlands, desperately trying to jump into some guy's palace and shake hands with some Austrian president, what I would like them to be doing is realizing we live where we live. Work out how Australia can have an independent foreign policy, an independent defence policy, remove these US bases and start building the relationships of trust as between equals with countries like Indonesia and Malaysia and Japan and South Korea, have a mature and positive relationship with China rather than trying to, join the United States in their next war with China. That's where our attention should be played. But instead we have them, desperately running around like some sort of lovesick puppy trying to find somebody in either North America or Europe who will sign a defence treaty with them.
Now, Israel's actions, as well as Australia's increasingly toxic relationship with the US, has resulted in a number of protests. The protests, especially against what Israel's doing, are considerably growing worldwide, including massive marches recently in Netherlands and Britain. What more could be done to grow these protests in Australia against Israel's actions, and what role are the Greens intending to take in that going forward?
Well, while this, latest unlawful attack on Iran has happened, and the bombings and the killings in Iran, and Iran's attacks back on Israel, while that's been happening, we've seen Israel kill hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Palestinians in Gaza, continuing to make just the act of going and seeking food aid a potentially lethal day in Gaza for kids, for mums, for dads. and the killing hasn't just continued; it's ratcheted up in Gaza by the Israeli military. We know that their oppression in the West Bank and other parts of occupied Palestine is also, ratcheting up. And what should Australia's response be to this? Well, for the better part of 2 years now, we've been saying to the Albanese government, there are some basic things Australia should do to hold a rogue state like Israel that's engaging in a genocidal war in Gaza and an illegal occupation of Palestine. There's things we should be doing and should have been doing for 2 years. We should have an urgent two-way arms embargo with Israel. We should not be sending off weapons parts like the F-35. We should not be washing them through the United States, other weapons platforms to Israel. And we should tear up the $2 billion or so in contracts that the Albanese government has either directly or indirectly with Israeli weapons manufacturers. Do that today. Of course we should be doing that. We should be sanctioning not just one or two extremely rogue, appallingly extremist members of the Netanyahu cabinet, but we should be sanctioning the entire cabinet and all of the key decision makers in the military and the civilian bureaucracies in Israel who are actively facilitating and directing the genocide in Gaza. We should engage in a further sanctions against the Israeli war industry and not be sending critical minerals and things like aluminium, which we know are essential for the Israeli war industry. We should not be exporting those to Israel, and we should be looking at the UN's prohibited list of Israeli entities and other entities, not just Israeli, that are profiting from the illegal occupation, and we should ensure that there are no Commonwealth contracts with those entities. But unfortunately, there's dozens of Commonwealth contracts with those entities. I mean, these are things we could be doing immediately, which would have a real impact. And I can't help but think that if Israel woke up and realized and had $2 billion of arms contracts cancelled with Australia, they'd take that more seriously than another tear-filled tweet and empty action and words from Penny Wong.
So are the Australian Greens still very much supportive of peaceful protest in support of all those things you just said? And do they have a program to increase support for those protests in Australia?
Well, we maintain our unflinching support for peaceful protests for Palestine, and we will always support the right for people to have peaceful protests for things that they absolutely care about. And when I think about what millions of Australians would expect their government to do, rather than criminalise protest and attack the people calling to end a genocide, which is what the Albanese government and state and territory governments around the country have also been willing to do, you would hope that the government was on the side of those millions of Australians who just want to end a genocide. They see the images of kids being killed and whole communities being threatened with annihilation, hospitals, schools, universities being destroyed. They want it to end. They want our government to do everything they can to end it. And they're on the streets demanding that. But instead of actually seeing where the real violence lies, which is in a viciously violent, militaristic, genocidal campaign against Gaza by the Israeli military, the Albanese government, the Minns Labor government here in my home state of New South Wales have regularly tried to make out that the peaceful protesters, the people trying to call for an end to the genocide, are the problem. And that's just obscene, absolutely obscene. And, we've seen UK Labor take it to the most extreme, trying to list a Palestinian advocacy group and a direct action group who I think spray painted some military hardware, list them as a terrorist organisation. I mean, that's where the sort of, global Labor branch seems to be taking this, and it's a deep threat to democracy.
David Shoebridge, an absolute pleasure catching up with you today. We're out of time. Thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure, Suzanne, and always good to speak.
I'm Suzanne Jones for Green Left. Thank you for joining us.